Polar bears typically avoid humans, but scientists believe this is changing. The Torngats, like many other areas in the southern Arctic, have typically had an ice-free summer season, during which the carnivores are forced to land and live off their body fat. Temperatures are rising due to global climate change. The Arctic is warming at roughly twice the rate of the rest of the world, and the period during which the animals must rely on their reserves has lengthened. The number of ice-free days in the Torngats area has increased from 125 to 175 days per year since the late 1970s. Some desperate bears eat goose eggs, grass, berries, and whatever else they can get their hands on. As the ice-free period lengthens, more bears are expected to come into contact with humans, potentially resulting in fatalities. After all, a human is just meat to a starving polar bear. On July 21, 2013, a float plane carrying the Sierra Club party descended toward the Torngats' eastern shore, weaving between the peaks. The scenery was desolate but beautiful. Ice-covered parts of glassy lakes and rivulets of water cascaded from cloud-covered mountain peaks. The plane touched down on Nachvak Fjord and dropped off the passengers. The pilot waved goodbye, leaving the 7 hikers with only the sound of waves lapping on the shore. The fjord felt prehistoric, as if they were in a pre-human world. The leaders were 2 experienced Sierra Club guides, Rich Gross and Marta Chase. They have led 13 tours together. They were accompanied by Larry Rodman, Marilyn Frankel, Rick Eisenberg, Kikab Castida Mendez, and Matt Dyer, a legal aid lawyer from Maine. The group's first task was to establish camp 150 yards from the shore. They brought with them flare guns, bear spray, and electric fences. They erected 2 electric fences, one around the campsite and the other around the area where they planned to cook and store their food. Each fence was approximately 3 feet tall and was made up of 3 parallel wires suspended from posts. The wires were charged to the tune of 5 to 7 kilovolts, which was allegedly enough to send a polar bear running. The hikers watched terns and gulls swoop by as they prepared cream of potato soup and pesto pasta for dinner. Wolves appeared from time to time. Some hikers stayed after eating to clean up. They'd all retired to their tents by the time the sky darkened, around 10:30 p.m. At 4 a.m., Castida Mendez emerged from his tent to discover that they were not alone. He yelled, "Polar bear on the beach." In the early morning light, a mother and her cub were walking along the shore. The other hikers emerged. They were within shouting distance of one of the world's most dangerous predators. The mother did not pay attention to the group. She disappeared with her cub a few minutes later. The next day, they decided to visit a nearby stream. They arrived at a stream around 3:30 p.m. The water was shallow, clear, and freezing. The stream provided relief for feet that had been in hiking boots all day. Castida Mendez was walking barefoot in the water when Dyer noticed something approaching them. "Polar bear," he shouted. "Return here." The animal was approaching them from about 150 yards away. It appeared to be larger and have a fuller coat than the female they'd seen earlier that morning. The hikers formed a polar bear defense formation. They screamed and made loud noises by hitting metal on metal. Even so, the bear kept coming. Gross drew his flare gun. The flare flashed, but the bear kept moving forward. The bear only ran away when the shell landed in front of it, causing a second burst. The group applauded and clapped. But the bear didn't get very far. It settled about 300 yards away on a ledge with a clear view of the camp. Rain was pouring heavily by the time the hikers arrived at their camp. The majority of the group retired to their tents to sleep, but Dyer was uneasy. He sat outside for an hour, staring at the bear until he fell asleep. They laughed as they shared stories about their previous trips and lives back home over dinner. They didn't say much about the bear watching them. It appeared to be a part of the landscape, just another detail in the magnificent setting. Eisenberg slept restlessly, and whenever he awoke, he checked to see if the bear was still there. It was still there. However, by 1 a.m., it had vanished. The hikers loaded their day packs and went exploring the next morning, despite the cold and rain. The weather had begun to improve by the afternoon, so they stopped at a rock above the campsite to take silly pictures of each other. Before going to bed that night, Gross walked around the campsite's perimeter, confirming that the electric fence was turned on. He tucked the flare gun into his boot before crawling into his sleeping bag. He awoke to screams at 3:30 a.m. Chase noticed a polar bear a few feet away from her tent window. It was on all fours, eyes level with her, enormous and white except for the black of its eyes and nose. "Rich!" she screamed, yelling for Gross. The bear ripped open a nearby tent and dragged it into the darkness. Gross grabbed his flare gun, dashed out the door in his underwear, and aimed at the bear. The creature was 75 feet away and heading west. It had something dangling from its mouth. He realized what was in the bear's mouth wasn't a thing at all, but Dyer. Dyer had been sound asleep when something woke him up. As his vision adjusted, he noticed two paws, each a foot wide, sweep across the tent's thin nylon. "There's a bear in the camp," he recalls yelling. The bear clamped its jaws around the man's head and yanked him out of the tent. Dyer heard his jaw snap as massive teeth pierced his head and neck. He could smell the bear's fishy, oily saliva. Dyer stared at the white stomach and yellow stains on the animal's hindquarters as it carried him away. Then he heard noises coming from behind him. His friends shout. The bear charged at the hikers, throwing Dyer into the air and slamming him into the ground. It moved toward the water without letting go of Dyer's head. Dyer had imagined how he would feel just before death, in that terrifying final moment. But instead of fear or panic, he felt a deep sense of calm. He saw a flash of light and heard the flare gun while his head was in the bear's jaws. The bear dropped him and fled. Dyer, thankfully, was in shock and couldn't feel any pain. Gross and Eisenberg run towards Dyer. They discovered Dyer's crumpled, blood-soaked body about 75 feet from the campsite. They assumed he had died. However, when Eisenberg knelt beside him, he noticed the man breathing. Castida, Mendez, and Rodman ran, and the four men returned Dyer's limp body. They placed him in the middle of the camp on a sleeping pad, covered him with 2 sleeping bags, and placed a sack under his head. Eisenberg, the former physician, only had 4x4 gauze pads, a roll of gauze strip, antibiotic ointment, splints, and scissors. Dyer's face was swollen and bruised, and his jaw was shifted. Eisenberg used scissors to cut through Dyer's blood-soaked hair. Wounds surrounded his face and head, but they were oozing blood rather than pumping it, which was a good sign. The most severe wound was a gash on his neck that appeared to have been filleted open. Eisenberg was able to see Dyer's carotid artery, which is the main blood supply to the head and neck. The artery was still intact, but if it tore, Dyer would bleed to death. Meanwhile, Chase dialed 911 using the satellite phone. She called a police dispatcher at 3:45 a.m. and told him her group had been attacked by a polar bear. One hiker had to be rescued, and the rest were in danger. But the area was covered in fog, and there was no way to launch a rescue until it cleared. The clouds had lifted by 8:30 a.m. Minutes later, the group heard a helicopter thump and saw it approaching. It landed, and medic Larry Brandridge got off. Dyer was carried to the helicopter by him and the hikers. Eisenberg climbed aboard to assist, leaving the others to wait for a boat to pick them up. The helicopter landed at Torngat Mountain's base camp and research station, which serves as a hub for scientists, visitors, and park staff. Dyer's stretcher was taken to the medical tent. The medic then removed the large bandage from Dyer's neck. The tent was filled with the odor of flesh. It smelled like death to Brandridge. Dyer's neck hole was about the width of a pencil and extended behind his jugular and toward his esophagus. Dyer was wicking blood into the wound with each inhalation. Brandridge quickly realized he lacked the equipment and expertise needed to save Dyer's life. So he and the base camp staff loaded Dyer back into the helicopter and flew him 45 minutes away to George River, where a first responder team with more sophisticated equipment was waiting. He'd be flown to Kujwa, a small Inuit community, and then to Montreal from there. Matt Dyer was finally admitted to Montreal General Hospital around midnight on July 25th, 20 hours after being attacked by the polar bear. He had 2 broken vertebrae, but they were high enough that no paralysis was expected. His jaw had been shattered. His left hand had several fractures. His right lung had blown out. He had several wounds, including a hole in his neck. His right arm's tendon had been punctured. Dyer regained consciousness just after midnight, despite his injuries. The remaining hikers arrived at the hospital on July 27th. Dyer was unable to speak due to the breathing tube in his throat, but he was given an alphabet board. He spelled out a question as he pointed to the letters. Would they all like to come to his house for a lobster bake? It was the kind of random humor that had endeared him to the group, and everyone was relieved to see that Dyer was fine. Dyer has recovered from his ordeal, with only scars on his face and neck and a husky rasp in his voice to show for it. On his arm, he has a new tattoo of a polar bear, surrounded by 6 stars, one for each of his travel companions. It reminds him of how close he came to death and the friendships he formed. We would like to thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please press the like button, consider subscribing to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you get notified when we come back with another exciting true story.